First time live on YouTube, over at the YouTube for folks who like YouTube instead. First time trying it, so sorry if you have issues with it. If I have issues with it, I think this will be cool because now we can have a live stream and then I can upload the video onto YouTube after. Um, so today is October 5th, 2023, almost 12 p.m. noon here Central Time. We're going to talk about the future of investing, new private stock markets that are assembling now under new legislation and new technology, presenting new opportunity for regular people like you and I. Is it you and me? Is it you and I? I never know. In addition to that, talk a little bit about the importance of opting into ecosystems and platforms that allow us to own our data and get monetized for that. So I'm going to give you a couple of use cases that I think are interesting. I just made a couple of videos about, and then we'll zoom out into the bigger picture here. I was speaking to a gentleman who owns about 300 acres of ranch land out in Oklahoma. He has a small business and he owns a brand for a food brand for direct to consumer meat and sauces and seasonings and things of that nature. Now, this particular business and ranch land to me is quite special because not only am I connected to it through a familiar relationship, but also it is derived from restorative agriculture practices, what has now been kind of going along the name of regenerative agriculture. So if those of you who aren't familiar, we have conventional farming and ranching methods, which most of you are somewhat familiar with these aspects. Everyone's seen the films, the horror films, if you will, of conventional, traditional practices. I wouldn't call it traditional, actually. I'd call it conventional practices of raising animals and simultaneously growing crops in ways that are extractory. They are degrading the health and the longevity and the sustainability of the land that these crops are being grown on, or that these animals are being raised on. And so what you have now is sort of a resurgence, especially with younger farmers and ranchers who are taking from traditional indigenous practices and then adding to that modern technological and mindset strategies to help really do one basic thing: produce the healthiest, most nutrient dense product, while and at the same time of, and not sacrificing the health of the soil and the land and the earth itself. So you could potentially raise a healthy animal or grow a healthy product, but are you doing it in a way, are you treating your overall process in a way that at the same time is producing and restoring health to the land that it's being raised on or grown in? This is extremely important. And so I have a small ranch that is wildlife exempt for native species in my state. Okay, I hear you. Wildlife exempt for native species in your state. Okay, so this might be of interest to you. This particular gentleman, y'all can go look up his company. It's Rep Provisions, REP, Rep Provisions. They're out of Oklahoma. Small business who is doing all the right things to raise the most healthiest and happiest animals, the most nutrient dense product, and restoring life biodiversity and health to the soil and the land on his ranch land. You start to do your research into the basic components of regenerative agriculture versus conventional farming and ranching, and you quickly see some basic things happening. Number one, on most conventional ranch lands and farmlands, there's a heavy amount of what is called tilling. These are tools that are used to dig into the ground so that they can easily then move tractors or other machinery over these areas that have been dug in the ground so that they can plant seeds. And this has been used for a very long time. Even in some more regenerative or restorative practices, you might have like a little bit of tilling happening with different types of tools that are less destructive. But overall, the idea is to have minimal or no tilling because, unfortunately, these have severe side effects, such as when you go in with these extractive tools to, dig holes in the ground. You're not just digging a hole in dirt. What you're doing is you are destroying and disrupting and breaking apart the soil microbiome that is filled with not only conglomerates of soil that have a lot of healthy microbiome activity, but also actual root structures. These root structures get torn apart and torn away from each other, and this causes a chain reaction of the degradation of the soil, meaning just the overall health goes down. This is one thing that you'll start to see transition once you go to regenerative agriculture. They have different methods of planting seeds or whatever that don't destroy the root structures. Now, the second thing you'll start to notice, and maybe this is the first, is an organic nature, meaning we're not using insecticides, herbicides, pesticides. We're not using any chemicals that are not organic, that are not safe for human consumption and or consumption of the animals or the crops that we're growing. And this is a big part of it. Obviously, we don't want things in our food and the same things we don't want in our body, we don't want in the animal's body, we don't want in the land, because it all has a massively negative impact on the health of our earth. And that translates directly into the health of the food that we eat and therefore our own bodies. The research is extremely prevalent at this point, showing that things like glyphosate and these other chemicals have remained in the water deposits and are in over 90% of humans right now. And they don't just run their course through the body like other minerals and vitamins there for a very long time, creating a corrosive effect on our bodies and minds. So this research is completely verifiable and validated. And if this is new to you, then I urge you to go kind of look into this for sure. These are cancer-causing chemicals. So regenerative operations do away with all sorts of chemicals in any way that is not organic. Now, the third thing that you're going to potentially see is, for example, if you have a farmer who is growing monocrop cultures, meaning they're just growing rows and rows and rows of one crop. It could be corn, it could be cabbage. But let me give you an example of how this differs from a regenerative agriculture operation. In conventional land, you have monocrop culture. So you're growing one crop down a whole line. You've got a patch of dirt that's lying next to it, and then the next line of crops next to that. And you might look at that and the farmer might tell you, this is organic. We don't use chemicals here. And you might say, well, that's great. Fantastic. This is a healthy product because they're not using chemicals. And that's what I want, right? That's the top tier. But you'd be wrong in that assumption, because just because a crop is not using chemicals, that's a good start, but it doesn't necessarily make it nutrient dense. It just means that it doesn't have chemicals. just means it doesn't have something that's in there ready to harm you. And so you look at this glaring difference and I've got videos of this posted on my Instagram showing exactly a demonstration of this in real life. But you can have an organic monocrop culture of corn, and there's no chemicals. But you compare that to a more, wild, messy, grassland, regenerative based operation. And the biggest glaring difference is that you don't have one species of crop only. What you do is you actually, based on your environment, your local species, and all the different plants that have symbiotic relationships to each other, and how helpful they are to each other, um, you basically get to pick and choose particular plants that help the main crop that you're growing, to help them grow as well and as nutrient dense as possible. And I'll explain what I mean by that. You can have a crop like a corn or a piece of cabbage that can reach, so far into the soil. But if the soil itself is not healthy and filled with a diversity of micro organism activity, then you have what's just dirt. You don't have any life in it. In order for a crop to receive nutrients and become nutrient dense so that it can grow healthy, you need nutrients in the soil. And the way you do that is through biodiversity. So you need more than just one type of crop growing to promote biodiversity. And this is exactly what regenerative agriculture focuses on. Biodynamic farming is also another name for it. But essentially, you are using other types of crops or plants that help promote biodiversity and promote the nutrient density and the health of the crop itself. And oftentimes, these are a category of that would be what are called cover crops. This is another feature or factor within regenerative agriculture. So cover crops have typically longer root systems than a typical crop, meaning they can go deeper into the soil and pull up nutrients and or water that the crop next to it is not able to reach to. And what's really cool is once you start to understand the science and just the miracle of life that farming and ranching can show you, is these long root systems pull up nutrients and water that the crop next to it can't pull up or find deep enough, and then share it to the crop next to it. It'll actually distribute it amongst the network around it to help its fellow plants and crops. And that's why you pick and choose based on, these symbiotic relationships between crops and plants. What are the best cover crops to plant next to the crop that you are planning on raising and growing? Another feature of cover crops and why they actually call them cover crops, going from the bottom up, is because they typically have long stems and they have leaves that are longer and wider. And so they literally cover the soil beneath them. And this is really, really important because, especially in the Midwest or even the South, you have sun more days a year than you do have rain or cloud cover. And that soil can get extremely hot. And this is where I'm going to draw a correlation back to organic farming, conventional organic farming. Just because it's organic, remember, doesn't make it nutrient dense. It just means there's an absence of chemicals. So if you're not taking it a step further, there's not a lot of nutrient density or health in the soil or the crop that you're growing. And these cover crops in a regenerative operation will help cover the soil, blocking some of that major sunlight coming in so it can stay cool. Compare that at around 80 something degrees on a hot summer day in Oklahoma or Texas to an organic conventional compound of monocrop culture with no cover crops. The soil is completely bare and exposed to the sun, leaving the soil at around 120 something degrees. Believe it or not, this kills off a ton of the fertility and the biodiversity and the overall life and health of the soil, that topsoil, which is where the crops are pulling their nutrients from to grow in a healthy and nutrient dense manner. So in conclusion, you don't have healthy product coming out of, an exposed soil without cover crops helping to keep that soil nice and cool. Um, and yeah, to answer your question, so regenerative farming is for produce as well, not just meat. Yeah, so you have regenerative. Regenerative is simply particular practices and or methods towards either farming or ranching. Now, traditionally, regenerative farming instills um, ruminary animals as part of their overall process. But there are biodynamic practices, aka regenerative practices, that apply to just crop growth alone. But again, most times for regenerative operations, you also integrate ruminary animals, meaning the fourth part of what I was just about to get into for regenerative farming, where you see in these types of operations is the use of ruminary animals. That could be cattle, it could be cow, it could be sheep, goat, these types of animals who graze through the grass and the weeds and the ranch or farmland and do a number of things that are extremely beneficial for the land itself. Bison is another ruminary animal. If you remember, thousands of years ago, America was the largest grassland and the most nutrient dense grassland across the world. And that was because we have millions of buffalo and bison who were roaming and grazing the land. And so, without getting too deep into it, the core components to understand are that in nature, we had bison and buffalo sort of grazing along the land nomadically. They didn't stop in one place for a long period of time and eat the grass until it was nil and it sort of stunted the growth and the biodiversity of the grasses that they were eating. No, they were constantly moving. And so this is a massively important piece that regenerative operations are using, leveraging through what's called planned grazing. You set up temporary fencing across different quadrants of your ranch land. You let the whatever you're using, bison or cattle or cows, graze for a short period of time on this particular quadrant of your land before moving them to a new quadrant, allowing this first quadrant to rest and achieve a resting period. And on a scientific level, through photosynthesis, through this resting period, it's a super beneficial way for them to kind of get caught up, restore growth, and allow another upcharge of nutrients to get into their stems and their leaves, while the ruminary animals are grazing on different quadrants. And by the time they get to this, first, fourth quadrant again, it has had enough time to rest and restore the growth and the nutrient density in the soil and its own stems and leaves. So this is really important. The other part of it is that when ruminary animals are grazing and moving, they're also fertilizing the ground through their manure that they're dropping and stamping into the soil. That is natural fertilizer, which is a massive biodynamic superfood for the soil to get for all that molecule or not molecules, but yes, molecules, but microorganisms to decompose and use as nutrients and food for the soil and the root systems and the crops and the animals. So this is the core components of these biodynamic and regenerative farming and ranching practices that completely make it entirely different from conventional methods. Now, with that being said, I've got a few comments here from John. Hey, John, nice to see you, man. Organic farmers use natural protection, plant mixing that creates symbiotic relations for greater growth. And they also have greater abundance in production. Absolutely. He said an article was published recently that only 10% of nutrition was found in tomatoes compared to a homegrown tomato. 10% is ridiculous. I agree. Cover cropping probably would have prevented the Dust Bowl disaster of the 20s. Incredible point that I missed out on, John. Thank you. This is something I want to point out. Again, coming back to cover crops, whenever you're covering the bare soil and allowing a cooling to happen instead of 120-degree temperatures to happen, you're not just letting it cool down, but you're also preventing things like erosion. Erosion is a massive issue in farming and ranching today. It's what created the Dust Bowl back in the 20s, which resulted in just a complete destruction of food security for so many families. I mean, go do your research in history. We had so many people die unnecessarily. It was a tough time for America. And this is all because when the wind comes through on topsoil, which is like where you want all that fertility to happen for whatever you're growing or feeding, the topsoil is that top 20-30%. That's the most nutrient dense part. Well, the air and the wind for dry dirt that's been overexposed to the sun gets swept out. And that's what created the Dust Bowl. The same thing goes for the erosion of water. If it rains too much and you have soil that is actually just dirt and doesn't have strong root systems that are structuring and conglomerating soil conglomerates together to give a more resilience to it, unfortunately, you have just very dusty dirt, and the water can come through, and it's a two-part thing. Good quality soil and a regenerative operation will retain water deeper into its soil structures for a much longer amount of time. But a conventional operation, whether it's organic or not, will have, dusty dirt, if you will, that will not retain the water, so quickly have a flooding effect, which then erodes the topsoil away into water runoffs and whatever. And that's a whole nother issue when you have non-organic operations running off chemicals into the water systems, local fresh water supplies, which affect us all. So this is also over-tilling tilling too much also does this and attributes to this problem that we have in farming and ranching. And so all these things contribute to massive climate issues that we have today. It's massive issues, and that's why we've seen a resurgence of great people who are doing great work, the hard work behind the scenes of restoring the earth and creating nutrient-dense products while producing a restoration effect of the earth. We have to forget this idea of sustainability, because if you're already so degraded to the point where we only have what experts say, 50 to 60 more farming cycles before, quote unquote extinction, then you can't sustain that. That's just sustaining survival till we die. We need to actually do the opposite of sustaining. We need to restore the health. And it is incredible to see before and after videos and pictures of the right practices being applied to essentially desert land, and watching through a 10 to 20 to 30 year period the restoration of grasslands. Y'all should really take the time, if this interests you, to go look up please don't let me forget his name. He is the father, quoted as the godfather of sort of regenerative agriculture, and he had a TED talk on some stuff years ago, and I'm gonna find his name here for you, I promise, here in a moment. If I don't find it, here it is. About 20 minutes. It's labeled "How to Fight Desert Savory." Alan Savory is a grassland ecosystem pioneer. And it's amazing the footage that he shows in his TED Talk of what looks like desert land restored to green, lush grassland through these practices. Now, there's also more digestible content that's more for younger audiences that are available now on Netflix. We had a documentary come out called Kiss the Ground. Kiss the Ground is an organization who's a proponent of all this stuff we're talking about now. An excellent documentary, voiced by Woody Harrelson, I believe. Great film, and they actually just created a sequel, which is being premiered in select cities around the nation right now. Will soon probably hit Netflix or some other major provider, called, what they call it, Common Ground. I've yet to see that, but I look forward to it. So we said all this, and now we want to understand, we got deep into regenerative agriculture. But now we want to understand what are, you know, how it affects us as individuals. Well, of course, it's pretty simple from the get-go, right? Put your dollars to work. If you're tired of the political system not serving you, then stop placing all your um, hope and faith into a broken system that hasn't served you for a long time. Okay? Put your dollars as your voting power towards something that not only is working around the clock to deliver you the most nutrient dense foods on the planet for you and your family, but simultaneously restoring the very health of our earth. That's what you do when you source your food from people who are managing the farm and the ranch land properly. Rep Provisions is a company that I source my meat from, but there are multiple companies out here who are doing a fantastic job at that. And so, depending on where in the country you live, it might be a factor of how close you want to be in relation to where you're sourcing your meat from. If you need examples, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share a list of companies that you can source your meat from in that aspect. But that's something that you can do first. But here's where we're moving to now. And instead of just purchasing meat or dairy or whatever from these type of ranchers, which I certainly suggest, we now have a place in time where legislation and technology is converging in a way that allows for new types of investments for regular individuals like you and I. What do I mean by legislation? I mean, quite literally, back in 2012, there's something that passed under the Obama administration called the Jobs Act. This is an acronym for Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. This was passed in a bipartisan manner, which is pretty rare in government today for both parties to be in agreement. And it was really in response to the 2008 banking financial crisis we were enduring and what had happened, to essentially allow for an easing of regulations for private companies to raise money. You see, public companies have Wall Street, and that's where the majority of funds are invested to today, from our 401ks, our Roth IRAs, our pension funds, and other venture capitalists and investors across the world. But what do the private markets have? The private markets, up until recently, have really only had a couple of options. Before 2012 and the passing of the Jobs Act, you really had the option of going through the very financially costly and the time-intensive process of going through an initial public offering, an IPO, meaning they go through the process of becoming a public company and issuing and trading stocks on Wall Street. There's many reasons why a private company might not want to do this. I just mentioned a couple. It's very costly to do, and it takes a ton of time to do it. But also, when you go through this process, it's extremely has a ton of regulatory scrutiny. And not all private companies are exactly having all their ducks in a row and ready for that process. They might be still smaller and trying to focus on just getting revenue in the door and what have you. And there's a certain level of loss of control whenever you go through this process, because obviously you are issuing stock to, at least national, potentially global shareholders who are buying your stock, and therefore they're given in the company, allowing them voting power a lot of times, and maybe that's not something a company is ready to do. The other pathway, my YouTube people, I'm sorry for looking at this TikTok screen the whole time. Maybe I can switch it up. The other pathway that these private companies go through is actually through leveraging venture capitalist types. So venture capitalists are, firms and entities that are taking funds from financial institutions and other income sources this is the biggest thing that most people don't realize. A lot of venture capitalist funds, it's not always their own money. It's your money. You place your money in some investment fund, and or the government on your behalf puts it into some pension fund, which then the pension fund goes to the venture capitalist firms, and then the venture capitalist has their fund that then trickles your money from fund to fund to fund, which absorbs fees along the way. And then all of a sudden you're happy with your 8% return, when in fact the venture capitalist heads are actually pulling in 2% of the total fund, whether or not they make good progress, and an additional 20% of the profits that they do earn, overall walking away with a 300% override. And you were never going to get access to that type of return until legislation like the Jobs Act was passed and made possible. And so, coming back to the example of a company who only had a couple of pathways, now at the same time, this presents new opportunities for both you as an individual investor and the company who's issuing the shares so that they can raise money. Because now the company can start to lean on direct to investor investments, meaning they can start to raise capital from regular people like me, directly from me, or private equity firms, or crowdfunding campaigns, which is, crowdfunding from the crowd, you and I. And that's good for them because obviously it retains more ownership for them in most cases, retains control. That can a lot of times when these companies leverage venture capitalist types, they lose culture, they lose the whole thesis of why they started their company. And so, you get new venture capitalists who are bringing in their own personnel sometimes to deploy, to lead the company, shifting the culture, changing the culture, hiring people, firing people, through this crowdfunding process, direct to people like you and me. Companies can retain their culture, retain more ownership, not have to go through massively stringent regulatory requirements, so they can retain a little bit more time and money to focus on what they really need to focus on. They can also, it also helps them to retain some of their more proprietary information. Another thing that is a problem within the venture capitalist world for some private companies is that they have to expose a lot more about their technology, their processes, and their financial situations, which you would consider to be a good thing. But at the same time, in the venture capitalist world, they have large networks. They're working with other companies, which in many cases can be potential competitors to the company that they're raising money for. And it happens. You probably wouldn't be surprised, but it happens. They share that proprietary information with others, and that can kind of put this company in a vulnerable position. So, moving forward and trying to close the loop on regenerative agriculture, how that relates to something like the new legislation and new technology that is enabling new private stock markets for people like you and I to not just get 8% return from Wall Street, but potentially get access to things like 100, 200, 300% returns. And just to let you know, this is not some, if you're unfamiliar with what I'm telling you, this is not totally a completely unique or novel idea. The idea of investing in private companies as regular individuals has been available to us since 2012 with the passing of the Jobs Act. And I can tell you that the private markets are actually growing twice as fast as public markets today. You can go and look at the private equity index versus the S&P 500 index and their historical performance. From 2001 till 2020, you had the S&P 500, which is the public markets, having a growth period of about, from 2001 to 2020, from about 1.5 to maybe about 5.5x. And you compare that to private equity indexes, starting at 2001 at about a 2x to roughly 10x in 2020. And so this is continuing to grow. Companies naturally, because of this new legislation, are choosing to stay private for longer. This is another trend we are seeing, and that's because they can, and they can continuously grow and raise money for their companies and scale without having to depend on going through a public transition or leaning on venture capitalist types. They can remain private and still raise $75 million a year. And now, with a new passing coming out of Senate just recently, soon private companies will be able to raise $150 million every single year. So companies are going to start staying private for longer than ever before. And now, with technology coming to a place where we're at now it's able to be even more democratized. Now we're able to really clean up and streamline to create what public markets had with Wall Street. Now private markets can have what we're calling sort of like a Main Street, a true sophisticated market for individual private companies directly and raising funds and allowing investments from people like you and I. Okay, and these are asset-backed and SEC regulated, totally legal and sophisticated markets. So some of you got to be wondering when this is going to end. I think we'll end it here in the next few minutes by wrapping up the connection between where we started and where we kind of got into with this private stock market idea and reality and tokenized farming. So imagine this future where farms are going to be able to represent their asset, which is their land and the business that they're producing off of their land, whether it's raising crops, raising nutrient-dense animals, or both. Tokenize it, meaning represent that asset into what we call a security token, which is the same thing. Don't get confused. It's just a stock. It's a stock, but it's in the form of a cryptographically secured token digitally, so that it's more secure. It can be fractionalized, and it makes everything a little bit more democratized, meaning more accessible to regular people all across the world, while retaining regulation, while retaining value. And so if you can represent, as a private company, a private farm or ranch, your asset that is your farmland and the production that it is producing into a token that I, as a regular person 1,000 miles away, can purchase, I now own stock of your well-managed regenerative farmland operation. And what is that going to do? Well, for one, it's going to provide dividends to me as an investor. So through the appreciation of the property value, through the appreciation of the dividends, and or both, I can earn dividends from my ownership of this tokenized farm. Let me give you some more context around this. Essentially, farmers will pay these dividends, which will allow, they'll also reinvest their fundraising into growth, to further growth for their companies. And here's another cool thing. These well-managed operations can then offer provisions for emergency food or water security as well. So as someone who's sitting at a computer right now in the middle of a modern suburb of Texas, I can own a piece of a well-managed regenerative operational farmland, 100, 200, 300, 500 miles away from me. And it represents ownership of a particular percentage of some of the most nutrient-dense food on the planet, and perhaps even water as well. Something that I can redeem for at a future date. Let's say, something goes down in the economy and, we're like freaking out over here, as y'all have seen over COVID with the rush to the stores of all the toilet paper, all the food, all the baby supplies flying off the shelves. There's nothing there, but I'm secure because I've got this regulated, verifiable digital asset stock that represents ownership in some nutrient-dense food and clean water from a ranch that I can go redeem it from. Now that's interesting. And as an investor, if you're not interested in that aspect, your returns will be made by the appreciation of the property value, the dividends, or both, as we said. And these degenerative farms will be inherently less valuable. This is extremely key because we cannot transform the system from any other way except for by market consumer demand. And that won't happen until regular people, which we are the many, start to put their dollars where it counts. And if my dollars start to get redirected from national corporations and international conglomerates instead to local farmer and rancher through sophisticated markets that allow ease of use, regulation, security, ownership of something better for me, more nutrient dense for me, and something that's restoring the health of the planet, well, I'm going to do that. And that is going to inherently start to reduce the value of these international corporations and retail chains that are not deriving product from regenerative farmland operations. They're deriving product from conventional farmland. And so what you'll see is the corporations start to change how they do things. They'll say, well, we either got to start sourcing from these little guys, which is probably not as sustainable, or we got to start talking to our farmers and ranchers we're sourcing from and have them start doing the right thing. Boom. This is where the entire system is going to start being flipped on its head. And that's what's so amazing about the changes that are happening in things like private stock markets that are going to affect everything else. Okay. This rethinks farm finance. This really sparks a revolution in financing for the causes that are helping us and our families and our future generations. And so that's, I think, where we'll end it here. I said I was going to go through a couple of examples, but I'm looking at the time, almost 45 minutes in, to kind of draw all that together. And of course, I'm going live quite often. I just did my first YouTube live, so this will be, hopefully, if I can figure it out, posted to YouTube so you can be rewatched later and watched by new people. But ultimately, if you're still here and listening, as a quick introduction before my goodbye, my name is Hunter. For the past 7 years, I've been working in digital engineering services. What that means is our company partners with mostly Fortune 100 companies: Microsoft, Amazon, Netflix, Verizon, AT&T, Blue Cross Blue Shield, you name it, across every industry, to essentially build software and digital platforms to assist them in their digital transformations. And through that experience, I got really excited about this new technology that was coming into play, 3-4 years ago, that I learned about it with distributed ledger technology, decentralization through blockchain, as well as cryptography and cryptocurrency. And the more and more I learned, the more and more I realized that although there was a ton of scam and fraud involved in all of this, the underlying technology remains something that will be applied and scaled for the next multiple decades and have an extreme, profound impact on our world. And if I can encapsulate it into one sentence, I want you to go home with this homework. Think about this. Every single system that you can look at, or industry, what this new technology ultimately enables is trust. And that is profound, but it won't have as great of an impact on you unless you start to critically think of what systems and industries, how they'll transform once the individual moving parts can actually trust each other. And I'll give you one example. Over 55 years ago, there was a company that created a common infrastructure that underpins Wall Street today. This infrastructure is owned by a company called Broadridge. You can go look this up. Broadridge has an infrastructure that hosts 100,000 plus 100,000 plus public companies and all the regulated participants that are required in that process and in that system. And they can do it seamlessly and flow through each other because they can trust each other because they're on a common infrastructure. That was available to Wall Street years ago, but we didn't have anything for the private markets, for the private companies. Up until 2016, when a company was created called Coreconx, that's Koreconx, they developed, using some of this technology I've just described, a common infrastructure, allowing private markets to now assemble on their common infrastructure, including all the required regulatory participants such as auditors, lawyers, SEC transfer agents, broker dealers. And now, because they're on this common infrastructure, they can actually not trust in each other per se, but trust in the technology and the mathematics behind it. And so that trust allows them to securely and safely share data between each other. And that reduces a massive bloat of time and money and redundancy in the markets. Up until this, you had a company who wanted to issue securities so they could raise money. They would go to their lawyer, prepare a package, and send it off to the auditor. The auditor would say, "Sounds good. Thank you. Now go to the broker dealer." They'd take that package, they go to the broker dealer, and the broker dealer would say, "Hey, it looks like you're doing the right thing, but all your stuff, yeah, that works for them, but not for us. We're different. We have different rules and procedures. So you're going to need to prepare it in this different way." Well, it sounds simple, but them going back, redrafting all that, preparing in the right way takes a ton of time and a ton of money. But they do it. They go back to the broker dealer, and the broker dealer says, "Good. Now you got to go to the transfer agent." Transfer agent goes with that package and say, "Hey, it looks good. You're on the right route, but we need it slightly different. We have different rules and procedures here." Oh, so you got to go back. Do you see the redundancy? All of that is time. It's time, it's effort, and it's money. And if you can reduce all that bloat because you can now trust each other through a common infrastructure, imagine the velocity of innovation and the leanness that companies can now operate in that will transform so many systems and so many markets and so many industries across the world. This is what is occurring through technology, through legislation, and we just gave a great example of what that's going to lead to for regular people like you and I with concepts like regenerative agriculture. Really, really excited about where this is all going to take us. And the fun part is it's not some future far off idea. This is happening now. This is assembling now. And really excited to be at the early stages of it because that presents often a ton of opportunities and just an overall journey to be part of something special. So with that, we're at about 50 minutes here. YouTube, thank you so much. John over here on YouTube had a lot of comments. Really appreciate you joining and contributing some really valuable comments here that helped me navigate some of my conversation. My TikTok people also had some great comments here. Thank you all so much. We're going to go live again. We're going to keep doing this stuff. I've also got a couple of YouTube videos that you can find that really go through the details of the history, where we got to where we are today, and the future not far away from us as it relates to things like the New York Stock Exchange, equity crowdfunding, and some of the concepts we discussed today. They're about 20, 30 minutes each. Really valuable in my opinion. I appreciate if y'all could check those out. Give me your comment and feedback on them. Let me know if they resonate. In addition, if you're interested in sort of this future investing concept that we finished off with, lucky for you, a quick call to action to you in my bio here on my TikTok. For my YouTube people, you go to any one of my videos and you'll find a link that will lead you to this as well. There's a call every single Thursday starting at 5:30 p.m. Central, where folks can log into a Zoom. They ain't got to show your face. You ain't got to contribute your voice. You ain't got to give your name, your email, your number. You just tune in anonymously, listen in to a live hosted call from people who are actually building and or have built this new sort of private stock market and the advantages that that offers to you. You'll join along with hundreds of other people who are in the know or are just joining for the first time to learn about this concept. Every Thursday, 5:30 p.m. Central. The Zoom details, again, are in my link there. So I really hope to see y'all there. I'll be there. I'm constantly trying to learn. This information I'm sharing with you today is because I've been able to learn a lot from calls like this that happen on a weekly occurrence. So I hope to see you there. Otherwise, please reach out to me. Check out my other content. Give me your comments. Reach out on the DMs. Let me know what you think. Let me know what suggestions you have, and we'll take it from there. Thank y'all so much. I'm going to end my YouTube stream. Thank you. And TikTok,